So today we are very glad to have Dr. Adrien Vogt-Schilb as our today's speaker. So Adrien is a senior climate change economist at the Inter-American Development Bank in the Chile office. So his work focuses on the design of effective and politically acceptable climate strategies. Adrien is a trained engineer holding a PhD degree in economics and is the author of 7 books of monographs and also more than 30 academic papers on climate change and development. So today, Adrien is going to talk about using IO to inform climate policy in Latin America and the Caribbean. So the presentation will be about 40 minutes and will be followed with a Q&A for 15 to 20 minutes. So Adrien, the floor is yours. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Kushang, and thank you everybody for the interest. Good morning, evening, or day, depending on where you are in the world. So, as Professor Frank just said, my name is Adrien Vogt-Schilb. I work at the Inter-American Development Bank. You know, I wanted to start with disclosure. I'm not myself an input-output analyst. However, I can share maybe 2 stories that some of you will relate to. One day I wrote a paper based on the input-output analysis, and I sent it to a journal. It was sent for peer review to a CG modeler, and that made me sad because he rejected the paper just not for being based on a CG. And you know, another day I typed the following line in my Python console that some of you might recognize. The computer gave me this answer, a very small number, and that made me happy. So maybe even though I'm not an input-output modeler, some of you would feel that, you know, deep down we're the same. So really, what I want to talk to you about is today is about how we use at the Inter-American Development Bank input-output analysis to make climate policy feasible. Right. So maybe first the Inter-American Development Bank. I'm sure many of you haven't heard of it. We're a regional development bank. So you probably know the World Bank. We like the World Bank, but for Latin America and the Caribbean. We help countries, you know, governments of sovereign countries build development projects and improve policy in general towards better development outcomes. Right. And in as far as what climate policy is concerned, the 3 things I want to tell you about today is first, you know, transitioning the economies of the world to a net zero economy. That's necessary, feasible, and it comes with benefit. But one problem is that it creates winners and losers. And what I'm going to show you today is how we've been using input-output analysis to identify the winners and the losers and inform policy that can compensate the losers and make sure the winners materialize to make the whole thing more politically feasible. Right, so let me first quickly explain this concept of net zero, right? I'm sure most of you have known about the Paris Agreement, the international climate change agreement, where all the countries in the world have agreed to do whatever it takes to limit, you know, global warming between 1.5 and 2 degrees Celsius above pre-industrial levels. And we have a ton of evidence compiled in this graph by the International Panel on Climate Change that says if we want to limit temperature close to 1.5 degrees, for instance, then we absolutely need to get to net zero CO2 emissions by around 2050. So in this plot, you see all of the scenarios of CO2 emissions over time that the IPCC has reviewed. And all of those who meet the 1.5 degree target, they all have this in common that they go to net zero by 2050 and then even go to negative territory. Based on this science, a lot of countries around the world, like more than 100, covering more than 80% of emissions, have either, you know, committed in law or in an international agreement, or at least in some document pledged that they want to reach net zero emissions. And usually they want to do that by around 2050. And so the main message I wanted to leave you here in this introduction is that at this stage, we know that getting to net zero emissions is feasible, or maybe not net zero, but at least for 90% of emissions, we already know the technical solutions. And while it's still the case that a lot of people in governments, especially in developing countries, tend to think of net zero as a sacrifice, that's not true. Instead, it's a net benefit. It's an opportunity for net economic benefits for developing countries around the world, for developed countries too, actually, to do the transition to net zero. And that's, first of all, because of technology. So in this plot here, I show that between 2009 and 2019, I'm sure a lot of you already know that, the price of solar energy has been divided by 10. And the price of wind energy has been divided by more than 3. And that was just up to 2019. Since then, that price has continued to decrease in general. And so today, it's cheaper to produce electricity using solar and wind than using coal or diesel or gas. And actually, for that reason, more than 90% of the investment globally is already goes to renewable energy for electricity. Another key technology is batteries. You need the batteries to help you stabilize the power grid if you're going to use solar and wind that do not function all the time. But batteries are also especially important for electric vehicles, of course, and they represent the bulk of the cost of a new electric car. But the cost of batteries has also been going down a lot. They're going to become competitive like anytime. So in some markets, they're already competitive and cheaper than gasoline and diesel cars. And in fact, around the world, 15% of new cars built are already electric. So that's just the technology is cheaper, but then you also have co-benefits, right? For instance, this is a photo of Santiago where I live a day when pollution is high. In Latin America and the Caribbean, it is common that countries lose 1 to 2% of GDP every year just because of the health costs of air pollution. Right, and if you transition to an economy where people take the bus, as vehicles are electric, then you can basically save that 1 or 2%, or a fraction of that 1 or 2% of GDP in losses. And another very important co-benefit, it's congestion. You know, if people take the bus or bike instead of taking cars, they're gonna use much less space on the streets. And you know, here again, it is common in the region, and it's common, I think, across the developing world, that countries waste 1, 2, or even 3% of GDP every year just in time lost in congestion. So you also have an opportunity to tap into these few percentage points of GDP if you can solve the congestion problem, which can be part of the transition to net zero. So I just wanted again to let you with this impression that it's feasible, countries want to do it, and that in general it comes with benefits, the transition to net zero. But again, a key issue is that it creates winners and losers, right? And today we're going to speak about two kinds of losers, of potential losers. One is consumers that can be hurt by increased price of gasoline and diesel if you put a carbon tax, for instance. And another is people who stand to lose the job, for instance, if they work in a coal mine or in a coal power plant, if you do the transition to net zero. And I'm going to show you with 3 or 4 papers how we've used input-output analysis, again, you know, to identify those potential losers and propose solutions to governments to transform these losers into winners as much as possible. Right. So again, we're going to start with the impact of removing fossil fuel subsidies on consumers. So I don't know if you know about fossil fuel subsidies, that what I said before, you know, the transition to net zero would suggest that countries would need to tax gasoline, for instance, to incentivize people to use the bus or electric cars. Unfortunately, today, the opposite thing happens. Globally, countries spend hundreds of billions of dollars actively subsidizing pollution by subsidizing, you know, gasoline, diesel, and natural gas. In Latin America and the Caribbean, it's almost $100 billion per year that is spent this way. You know, in some countries, it represents several points of GDP, is what you see on the figure in the right. These are numbers from the IMF. Now, the IMF tells us if instead of subsidizing gasoline and natural gas and diesel, the governments were to put taxes to internalize congestion and pollution, as the cost that I presented before, and also accidents, damage to infrastructure, etc., then they should be raising 5 trillion per year instead of spending 300 billions per year. And if they did that, that would reduce CO2 emissions by almost a third. It would eliminate more than half of the air pollution related deaths globally, and it would raise global it will raise revenues for governments who need it, to fund development priorities. So there's a strong case that we should remove fossil fuel subsidies. But as I was saying before, a key issue with removing fossil fuel subsidies. Okay, it comes with all these benefits, but main problem, people don't like the idea of the government increasing the price of gasoline. This is a photo of a riot, or maybe not a riot, a demonstration against carbon taxes in Australia, against like higher gasoline prices in Mexico. Around the world, people are not fond of higher energy prices, and they're not because they know that increasing energy prices will hurt them as consumers. And us from the Inter-American Development Bank, we don't want to hurt consumers for 2 reasons, right? The first one is we don't want environmental objectives such as climate change to result into social problems, right? Because we want to do sustainable development, which is advancing environmental, social, and economic goals at the same time. And also from a very pragmatic perspective, in democracies, if consumers are not happy, they're not going to re-elect the government. So it's not institutionally sustainable to try to increase the price of gasoline without attending the downsides of it. Now, the good news, and that's the last slide before I actually talk about input-output analysis. The good news is that there is a lot, dozens of countries who have tried to remove fossil fuel subsidies in the last 20 years and succeeded. And there's also dozens of them who have tried and failed. And so we now have a lot of experience and a lot of consensus among NGOs, international development banks such as the IDB or the World Bank, the IMF, academia, about what makes it more likely for countries to succeed when they want to remove energy subsidies. And there's basically 4 things. The first one is, before increasing the price of gasoline and diesel, make an analysis of what's going to be the economic impact, who's going to win and who's going to lose. And based on your diagnostic on who's going to lose, propose, measures to compensate them. For instance, the poor consumers might lose. Maybe you use cash transfer to help them. Maybe taxi drivers will lose. Maybe use specific measures for them. And then instead of trying to increase the price of gasoline overnight, take time. Start with communicating with the people while you're doing it, and do it over, 10 years maybe, not like 2 days. And I put in red here what the input-output analysis that we did at the IDB helps us do specifically, right? Which is analyze the impact and understand what's who are the consumers that would be hurt and how they can be compensated. So let me show you how we did this. Starting with a paper we actually wrote with Professor Feng here like a few years ago that was covering 11 countries in Latin America and the Caribbean. But for now, I'm just going to show you an example based on the numbers in Chile. Right, so if you don't use input-output analysis, if you superficially look at the problem, it's first going to look in most countries in the world that increasing the price of gasoline would be progressive, meaning it would hurt rich people more than poor people. But if you look at these numbers on the left, they show how much of their income consumers in Chile spend on gasoline. And you see that poor household in the bottom quintile, the 20% poorest household in the country, they only spend 0.3% of their income on gasoline, while the top income group spends 3% of their income on gasoline. And the reason it's quite simple is that rich people are much more likely to own a car than poor people. So if you only have this information that comes from a usual household survey in mind, you would reach the conclusion that if you increase the price of gasoline by 25 cents per liter, which is what we simulated here, people in the top quintile will see a higher relative cost than people in the bottom quintile, right? But this very simple calculation misses the thing, which is that the poorest people in Chile, in this case, who don't have a car, they just don't walk everywhere. They also take public transport, right? And if you increase the price of diesel and gasoline, the price of the bus will probably increase. And that's exactly what the input-output analysis allows you to do, which we have done in this paper, which is given that the input-output tables tells you how much gasoline and diesel goes into the making of different goods and services in the economy. You can very simply simulate if you increase the price of gasoline by 25 cents per liter, how much would that increase the price of goods and services in the economy? And public transport would be one of the most, in the case of Chile, would be the most affected good, right? The price of public transport, we find, would be increased more than 6%. But you can do that with all the goods. Electricity would go up, the value of durable would go up. And then you can compare these numbers not only to how much consumers spend on gasoline and diesel, but on how much they spend on everything, right? So, for instance, this is the household budget in Chile for the top quintile and the bottom quintile. You see again that poor people spend much less on gasoline and diesel than rich people here. But for instance, you'll also see that poor people spend a lot on food, while rich people spend less on food. And for instance, rich people spend more on entertainment. That includes restaurants, which is also a reason why they spend less on food directly. And so multiplying basically these numbers from the input-output analysis to this number from the household survey, you can complement the diagnostic that the direct impact of increasing the price of gasoline would affect rich people more than poor people with an estimate of what would be the indirect impact. That again comes from the input-output analysis. And in this case, we show actually, and that's typical, it's not the case in all the countries, but it's typical that the direct impact would be progressive because of the car issue, but the indirect impact would be regressive. And what I really like about this input-output analysis that we've done, that I want to insist that to review it too, that the CG is not as good as doing, is estimating specifically by which channels people are affected. And that's going to help us in the rest of the presentation design compensation measures, right? In this case, you can show that the spending on public transport is a key reason why poor people would be affected, and also spending on food, which is interesting, because food doesn't come to mind as something that's very affected by gasoline prices. You just have to move the food from the farm to the cities, typically in a truck that uses gasoline or diesel. So the price of food increases modestly when you increase the price of gasoline and diesel. The input-output analysis tells you that. But then poor people spend so much on food that even a small increase in the food price gives you a significant increase in the share of the income they now have to spend extra to be able to afford the same amount of food. Okay, so that's what we do with the input-output analysis. And then, sorry, the title was missing. And then the good news is that even though the poor people tend to be more affected as a percent of their income, if you look in total amount of dollars, what increasing the price of gasoline would do to households, again, in total amount of dollars, not in percent of their relative income, you find that rich people will pay much more. And that's because 1.1% of the income of the top 20% is much more money than 1.4% of the income of the bottom quintile. Right? So if you look at this from the perspective of the government is going to get all of this money here in green. And what I show in this graph is that if you look at the poorest household, for instance, the first and second quintile, the 40% poorest households in the economy, which is typically what's defined as poor people, altogether they're just going to pay 20% of all the money that the government is going to get from increasing the price of gasoline in this case. And so the idea here is that if the government could use, these 20% of all the revenues that it gets from the gasoline to give it back to poor people, then it would compensate, this like a poor and vulnerable households that we were concerned with when we said the issue is increasing the gasoline prices, that it affects poor people. Right. So in the two other papers that I want to show you about consumers today, we're going to discuss how specifically can the government use this money that he gets when the prices of gasoline are increased, and how can it spend it back to help poor and vulnerable households, right? And maybe let me show you an example from a paper we did in Ecuador with colleagues, German colleagues from the Mercator Institute, right? So Ecuador is typical of what I've been saying before. As a developing country, it used to spend $2 billion per year subsidizing gasoline, diesel, and LPG. LPG is the gas cylinders that a lot of people use for cooking in developing countries, and also electricity. That was up to 7% of the budget of the government. Maybe the budget for health was 5%. It's like, I don't remember this number, but it's common that in developing countries that subsidize that much fossil fuels, they spend more on fossil fuels than they spend on health or education. And then another piece of context that's important is that, again, as many developing countries, like, again, most of them, the government has a cash transfer program. It's called Bono de Desarrollo Humano, BDH, in the specific case of Ecuador. So that's a program by which the government says, if you qualify, we're going to send you every month about $15 per month for your family. Similar to food stamps in other countries, or sometimes they call that welfare programs. It's very, very common that countries have some kind of program like that to basically help poor people. And so the question we have in this paper is, first we assess the distributional impact of removing the subsidies with input-output analysis, exactly as I've shown you before. And then we say, what if the government, increases the amount of the Bono de Desarrollo Humano, or uses other ways to try to transfer back the money to the poor people to compensate them, right? And so I'm not showing you again how we do the distribution analysis because it's the same. I'm directly showing you a couple of results. These are two simulations where we remove, let me explain this graph. First, we remove electricity subsidies, and that has a red impact here on the bottom. So it's going to reduce the real income of everybody because now electricity is more expensive. Electricity tends to have a uniform impact across quintiles. That's typical too. And here we show, as before, we show the impact of increasing the price of electricity in Ecuador on how much households have to spend relative to their income. Here is the poorest quintile, the richest quintile in Ecuador. And then on green, we show the impact of increasing the Bono de Desarrollo Humano, so the cash transfer, by $11 per month. And so what we found out when we did that is that, as you can see, that would increase the income of a lot of poor people. It would also affect a little bit the highest quintile, because that's a common issue. The Bono de Desarrollo Humano doesn't only go to poor people. Some rich people get it. And actually, some poor people don't get it. We're going to talk about that later. But we designed this, which shows the $11 per month number in the paper in a way that by construction, the second quintile, so the bottom 40% of the population breaks even. Right, so very poor people, they make more money in the Bono de Desarrollo Humano than what they lose because of higher electricity prices. Second quintile breaks even. Richer people, they're going to spend more on electricity. That's what they're going to get back on the Bono, especially when expressed in percent of the income. But we did the same thing with gasoline. You remove the gasoline subsidies, you increase the cash transfer to $6 per month. Q2 breaks even. Poor people are net win. Rich people net payers. right? And the good news is when you do that, as I showed you before, with my 20% number, is that you don't have to spend back all the money as a government that you win by not subsidizing electricity and gas. Actually, you would still have as a government $800 billion per year of free cash after that. We have two other experiments. One, we remove diesel subsidies. In this paper, we separate diesel and gasoline. So that's expensive for everybody, mainly because it increases the price of all goods and services that are moved. Think of my example of food before, and also because of public transport. And in this experiment, what we do is that we make public transport free for the bottom 40% of the population. And they don't quite break even, but that cancels most of the impact because as I showed you before, the first way in which diesel prices impact people is through the price of buses. And last experiment we do, we remove the subsidies on LPG, the cylinders of gas, but we give 2 cylinders free per month, if I remember correctly, to the poorest household in the country. And the idea here is that if you did all of that at the same time, you would make, again, the second quintile break even. You would reduce poverty because poor people win in nets with all the compensation. And you would still save more than $1.5 billion per year. So it's an example of how using the input-output analysis, you have, you can talk with the Ministry of Energy, the Ministry of Finance in Ecuador, and say, look, these are ways of saving money while making everybody happy, or not everybody, but making popular, the most popular, the poorest household in your country happy, and saving money. Okay, in the next paper, I want to we went a little bit deeper into a complicated question, which is here I've been talking about consumers by grouping them into quintiles, and I am telling you the second quintile breaks even. But are there people within the second quintile and the first quintile who would still see a lot of costs? The quintiles are not like just one guy. There's like millions of people in each quintile, and we're not really looking so far as it's typical in the literature what happens within the quintiles. So in this paper, we did something similar, but instead of focusing in Ecuador, we did it for 16 countries in Latin America and the Caribbean, which all have cash transfers like the Bono de Desarrollo Humano in Ecuador. But one issue that I mentioned before is that everybody who's poor doesn't get the cash transfer. So if you increase the amounts delivered through the cash transfer, the people who are poor but don't have the cash transfer, they will probably have to pay for higher bus price tickets, for instance, and higher electricity prices and higher gasoline prices, but they're not going to get more money on the other hand. So they're going to be net losers and they're going to lose a lot. So that's the issue here. And also, we realized, I'm going to show you in a minute, that it's not this idea that the poorest households are the most affected is too simplistic. It's actually there's like rich people that are also very affected by if you increase the price of goods and services. And then instead of looking at fossil fuel subsidies, in this paper, we look at carbon pricing. So carbon pricing works the same because it's a tax you put, on gasoline and diesel, and also on fertilizers that you use for agriculture that creates greenhouse gases. And input-output analysis allows you to look at the impact of that, especially when you do like regional papers like this one. There's I'm sure most of you know GTAP, and there's a environmental account extension of GTAP that already gives you the GHG emissions that are generated when all the goods and services in the table are produced. So you can immediately simulate what it would do to the costs if you increase if you put a carbon price or if you put a tax on greenhouse gases. We look at whether the cash transfers can really compensate everybody, given what I said that everybody doesn't get that. So here we're changing a little bit the way we're presenting results in the sense that now the quintiles are in the vertical axis, right? So if I take Ecuador, for instance, as before, this is the poorest 20% of the population in Ecuador. This is the top 20% of the population in Ecuador in terms of income. And on the x-axis, it's the fraction of their income that they would have to spend on a carbon tax. And as before, we show that rich people on average would be less affected than poor people. So if you look at the black line in the middle each time, it's the median impact for the people in this quintile. And it's much higher it's higher for poor people than for rich people, as we just said in Ecuador. For instance, if I go to Chile, same result as before. Poor people would spend a higher fraction when you take into account the indirect impact than rich people on the carbon price. But if you look at all the distributions of impacts within the quintiles, we call that the horizontal impacts. That's why we changed the axis. You see that there is a lot, for instance, of rich people in Ecuador here that would be relatively more impacted than most of poor people in Ecuador here. Right. So within the quintiles, there is a distribution of impacts, and actually, in general, the spread within quintiles of the impact of the carbon price is higher than the differences across quintiles. Look, this is very visible in Argentina. In Argentina, in all income groups, you have people who are not very affected, people who are very affected, and that is a bigger difference than what you see in blue here, which is the difference between how much the top quintile is affected on average versus how much the bottom quintile is affected on average. So the quintile average masks a lot of impacts, is really what we're saying. And we did an analysis actually, so we have these household surveys, right? So we see how much people spend on gasoline and on everything. And we also see whether they report having access to a cash transfer as part of their income. We show this, which is in all the countries, the people who have access to cash transfers, right? So like the Bono de Desarrollo Humano in Ecuador, the blue bubble at the top of all the graphs here. Then the people who are poor, just like defined as being of the 20% bottom of the population in yellow here. And the people who would be most affected by a carbon price, defined as being in the top 20% when you rank households per how much the carbon price costs them relative to their income. These three groups are completely different. They somehow overlap, but not a lot at all. For instance, if you just look at Ecuador, there is like in yellow here, most poor people do not get the Bono de Desarrollo Humano. So if you put a carbon tax and you recycle the revenues through the Bono de Desarrollo Humano, you're going to compensate these guys here, the overlap between the yellow and the blue spots, but you're not going to compensate this guy here. And then there's a lot of people who are not poor, but who are very impacted by the carbon price, and you're also not compensating them because they don't get the cash transfer. Right? So I think that's one of the first times that people were emphasizing this in the literature. And the last step was, okay, but that doesn't mean we cannot do anything. We can, again, we have access to how the price of everything increases thanks to the input-output analysis. And so we can look in detail at the reasons why people would be very affected, and offer suggestions of how to compensate them that match those reasons. For instance, in a lot of countries, we see that owning a car is a bigger driver of whether the carbon tax hurts you than whether you're poor or rich, which makes sense once you know that, right? And so if that's the case, we can tell the government, okay, maybe what you can do, for instance, a compensation mechanism is spend more on public transport or spend more on subsidizing electric cars that give options to people to move without paying the carbon tax. Or in a lot of countries, whether you use LPG for cooking is a key driver. And in this case, as we had simulated in Ecuador before, you can suggest to the government maybe give free LPG cylinders to some people. Or in some countries, it's using electricity, for instance. That's just an example of what we've done in this paper. Okay, Sorry, so that was like 3 papers on showing you how we use input-output analysis to look at the losers if you increase the price of goods and services, either through fossil fuel subsidy reform or carbon pricing. And now, in the last 5 minutes to 10 minutes, I want to show you a completely different set of possible losers in the transition to net zero, which is workers, right? The intuition is pretty clear, is that, if you move, for instance, from coal power to renewable power, the people who work in coal power are going to lose their jobs, and the people who work in renewable power are going to win jobs, right? So that's just perfect examples of winners and losers, even though the transition to net zero emissions can be positive overall. And here, I just want to very quickly tell you about a paper that we actually very recently published, again with Professor Fang, that looks at this issue, right? So Chile is one of the few countries, maybe the 3 or 4 in all of Latin America and the Caribbean, where coal is still an important source of electricity production. But Chile is also one of the most ambitious countries in the world in terms of climate action. And as a result of that, Chile had a plan to close down all the coal power plants in the country. And back in 2019, they asked us, can you help us estimate what would be the labor impact of doing that? And we used an input-output analysis to simulate the labor impact at the national level, but we complemented it as we usually do with a household service that was specifically looking in this case at where are the coal workers in the country, right? So let me explain this very briefly. This here shows 2 scenarios of electricity production in Chile over time for 2017, which at the time was historical data, 2013 and 2015. The first column here is the baseline and long-term energy plan that the Ministry of Energy was using at that time. And I just want to show you that in red here, we have coal power. So coal power in the baseline stays the same or even increases a little bit over time, despite solar power increasing here in green, for instance. And also wind power also increasing in the baseline because, wind and solar, as I said, are already super cheap. They are in Chile, they're especially cheap. They're like Chile is one of the countries where renewable energy is the cheapest in the world. So they were already thinking about increasing renewable energy, but they were not thinking necessarily about closing down coal power. And then this is one of the scenarios we looked that as an alternative. We actually closed down all the coal power plants, or almost all of the coal power plants, by 2030, and we compensate them. We compensate that with more wind and more solar, in addition to a little bit of hydro. And, again, I'm not going into the details of the method because most of you actually know this much better than me. But with the input-output analysis, you can show not only the direct impact. If you have the coefficients which we had to get about how many people typically work to produce 1 unit of energy with solar, 1 unit of energy with coal, etc., but also the indirect impacts when you take into account the industries that supply these types of power plants. And what we find, as expected here in blue, sorry, the color changes. In blue, there's like 4,000 people in Chile who work on in coal power plants that could lose their jobs, obviously, if you close down the coal power plants. And then we show, of course, that would be that you would create jobs in solar and wind. But again, we also show you would create jobs in mining, in services, because solar and wind use these upstream industries. And so in total, you have a net job creation of a few thousand, like about 12,000 workers, right? So 12,000 net new jobs is not a lot by 2030, because just to give you a reference point, in Chile, maybe in a month, you're going to create 10,000 jobs in the economy just because of economic growth. So saying, in the next 10 years, we're going to create this amount shows that it's a positive story. It's not like the solution to remove unemployment and create millions of jobs in Chile. It's something positive. It's not a macroeconomic impact because the numbers are small, but mainly you see it's a problem of dealing with winners and losers. And as I was saying, we did a survey to see where those coal workers are, and it turns out this is a map of Chile, that there's actually 6 towns in Chile where all of the coal power plants are, that are all in the north. And actually, in some of those towns, it's up to 7% of the workforce who's in a coal power plant. So you're really showing, again, it's not a macro national issue. It's an issue that at the local level, you are discussing entire towns that could lose their main economic center. And so with that, we suggest ways of dealing with that to the government, such as social protection retraining or adjusting the timing of closing down the coal power plants to when the people would retire anyway. Last slide, we did something that I'm not going to present in detail, similar at the regional level with the International Labour Organization, showing the transition to net zero emission would create jobs in Latin America and the Caribbean. It's not a big numbers, really. What we show is this is pointing with numbers to this issue that it creates winners and losers. And so what we've been doing for years now at the Inter-American Development Bank is help countries in the region design long-term climate strategies. And 3 of the objectives of the long-term climate strategies are identify who could lose and define complementary policies to compensate them. As we've shown today, input-output analysis is a key way of doing that. Identify who could win and make sure that the wins do appear. If you're finding you could have more solar jobs, make sure that you have the skills for solar jobs, make sure you have the regulations that make it easy to have solar jobs, make sure the solar jobs are good jobs. And also, finally, make sure when you design climate policies that you consult with the people who could win, you consult with the people who you could lose, and you give them a voice in the design of all of these climate policies. That's basically what we do. And so, again, thank you so much for your attention. I hope I convinced you that getting to net zero is doable. It comes with benefits. The problem is winners and losers. And input-output analysis is a very relevant tool to identify the winners and losers and inform climate policy.
Thank you, Adrien. Yeah, that's a very important topic, in particular, how to use IIO method for, policy decisions. I think that's, certainly the very crucial and the urgent part of the to solving the current problem. So now we stop recording, and we want to start